The infratemporal fossa is exposed by removing a part of the diaphragmatic arch and the radius of the mandible. This is the masseter muscle reflected upwards. This is the temporalis muscle passing to its insertion into the coronoid process of the mandible. It's now reflected upwards to reveal the deeper structures of the infratemporal fossa. Notice the nerves and the vessels that enter the deep surface of the temporalis muscle to supply it. This is the head of the mandible, dislocated from its place where it forms the temporomandibular joint. This is the articular disc which lies inside the joint and divides it into an upper and a lower compartment. This is the insertion of the lateral pterygoid muscle into the front of the neck of the mandible. This muscle has an upper head arising from the infratemporal surface of the greater wing of the sphenoid and the infratemporal crest, and a lower head arising from the lateral surface of the lateral pterygoid plate. Notice two structures appearing between the two heads. The first is the buccal branch of the mandibular nerve, which runs over the lower head to reach the cheek to supply it with sensory fibers. The second structure is the second part of the maxillary artery, as it forms a bend before it disappears into the pterygopalatine fossa to become the third part of the artery. The maxillary artery is better exposed by reflecting the lateral pterygoid muscle. This artery arises from the termination of the external carotid artery opposite the neck of the mandible. The other terminal branch of the external carotid is the superficial temporal artery. The superficial temporal artery ascends inside the tissue of the parotid gland and appears just in front of the tragus of the ear. The maxillary artery runs forwards deep to the neck of the mandible, where it is called the first part. This first part of the maxillary artery gives off two main branches, the inferior alveolar and the middle meningeal arteries. The inferior alveolar artery passes downwards in company with the inferior alveolar nerve to enter the mandibular canal together. The middle meningeal artery passes upwards between the two roots of the auriculotemporal nerve to enter the foramen spinosum. This is the auriculotemporal nerve. It arises from the posterior division of the mandibular nerve by two roots. It then passes backwards deep to the neck of the mandible. It appears at the upper end of the parotid gland, just in front of the tragus of the ear. The part of the maxillary artery deep to the lateral pterygoid is its second part. It appears between the two heads of the lateral pterygoid muscle. This second part gives off only muscular branches to the muscles of mastication. third part of the maxillary artery is the part present inside the pterygopalatine fossa. It gives off many branches to the upper jaw, nasal cavity, palate, and orbit. Notice two important nerves passing downwards from under cover of the lateral pterygoid muscle. These are the lingual nerve anteriorly and the inferior alveolar nerves posteriorly. They arise from the posterior division of the mandibular nerve and run downwards on the surface of the medial pterygoid muscle. The inferior alveolar nerve gives off the nerve to the mylohyoid muscle, lower down near the entrance to the mandibular canal. This nerve to mylohyoid is motor to the mylohyoid muscle and the anterior baliogastric. The sphenomandibular ligament lies posterior to the inferior alveolar nerve. It stretches from the spine of the sphenoid to the lingua of the mandible, which guards the mandibular foramen. The lingual nerve has the corda tympani nerve joining its upper part from behind. The corda tympani is a branch of the facial nerve carrying taste sensations to the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, as well as parasympathetic fibers to the submandibular and sublingual salivary glands. The lingual nerve leaves the surface of the medial pterygoid muscle and comes in contact with the back of the socket of the third molar tooth. Thereafter, it lies on the surface of the hyoglossus muscle. The mandible is elevated to show its deeper surface. This is the insertion of the medial pterygoid muscle into the inner aspect of the ramus of the mandible. And here is the lingual nerve leaving the muscle in contact with the last molar tooth to enter the submandibular region. Back to the medial pterygoid. This muscle has a small superficial head which arises from the maxillary tuberosity superficial to the lower head of the lateral pterygoid, and has a larger deep head which lies deep to the lateral pterygoid and arises from the pterygoid fossa and the medial surface of the lateral pterygoid plate. This is the end of the maxillary vein which accompanies the maxillary artery. It joins the superficial temporal vein to form the retromandibular vein. The retromandibular vein descends superficial to the external carotid artery till the lower end of the parotid gland, where it enters into the formation of the external jugular vein and the common facial vein.